I'm going to give you the current ultimate guide for Uber accident claims and settlements. If the Uber driver has the app on but has not yet accepted a ride request, this is the worst case for the Uber driver. If the car that hit the Uber driver does not have bodily injury liability coverage or enough of it. If the Uber driver has the app on but hasn't yet accepted a ride request, he or she is at the mercy of the other driver having bodily injury coverage. In other words, if the driver that hit the Uber driver does not have bodily injury coverage, the Uber driver may have zero case at all. If the Uber driver has not yet accepted a ride request, the Uber driver's best case scenario is that the car that hit him, or truck or whatever vehicle, has plenty of bodily injury liability coverage to pay for the Uber driver's pain and suffering, out-of-pocket medical bills, and lost wages. The worst case scenario for the Uber driver if the app is on and they did not accept the ride request is that the Uber driver is very badly injured. Let's say the Uber driver had to have several surgeries and the car that hit him has no bodily injury coverage. The Uber driver may be left with huge hospital bills, lots of pain and suffering, and no recovery at all. Another large change that Uber made on its auto insurance policy is even if the driver accepts a ride request, while he or she is on his way to pick up the passenger, there's only $20,000 of uninsured motorist insurance. When Uber first came to Florida, there was $1 million of uninsured motorist insurance coverage. So that's a $980,000 decrease in uninsured motorist coverage. Now, the uninsured motorist coverage only applies if the other driver is at fault and doesn't have bodily injury liability coverage or enough to pay for the value of the Uber driver's claim. If the Uber driver is badly injured, the best case scenario for him or her is that the other driver either has plenty of bodily injury liability coverage or that the Uber driver had accepted a ride request and had passengers in the car. Under this scenario, the Uber driver is entitled to $250,000 of uninsured motorist insurance for the entire accident. So that amount of money is going to be split between the Uber driver and any passengers who are also injured. Let's talk about who is not affected by Uber's decrease in uninsured motorist insurance coverage in Florida. If the Uber driver is 100% at fault, no one is affected by Uber's drop in uninsured motorist insurance coverage. For example, if the Uber driver hits a bicyclist, hits someone in another car, hits a pedestrian, the fact that Uber has significantly decreased its uninsured motorist insurance coverage has no bearing on the person who they injured's claim. This is because the person who they injured is making a claim against the Uber driver's bodily injury liability coverage, which is different from uninsured motorist insurance coverage. I mentioned that I settled a case for $260,000. He fractured one of the lamina of a vertebra in his spine. He had a 6-day or so hospital stay. He did not need surgery, fortunately. Overall, he made a pretty good recovery. He did have an epidural injection to his back. Now, in that case, the other van's insurance company paid the $260,000 settlement. The other driver was at fault. So in this $260,000 settlement, the other van's insurance company made an initial offer of $150,000. Insurance companies often make their first offer, which is a lowball offer. We ultimately settled the case at $260,000, which is about $110,000 more than the initial offer. Now, in that $260,000 settlement, Ray was the Uber driver, and out of the $260,000 settlement, about $254,682 was paid for pain and suffering. The rest was what I paid back to pay off his Medicaid insurance lien and out-of-pocket medical bills, and that was about 2% of the settlement. In other words, $5,318. And in an Uber accident case in Florida, like Ray's case that settled before a lawsuit, the attorney's fee is 33 1/3% of the entire settlement plus costs. In this case, the attorney's fees and costs were about 33 1/3% of the settlement. In other words, the costs were very small. After my attorney's fees and costs and paying off Ray's Medicaid, Molina insurance lien, and out-of-pocket medical bills, Ray got a check for $167,982 in his pocket. Now, that does not factor in the high-interest loan that he took. So if we look at the total amount that I had to pay back from the settlement to the Medicaid plan and the out-of-pocket medical bills, the total settlement of $260,000 was about 49 times those out-of-pocket Medicaid lien and out-of-pocket medical bills. Now, if you're either an Uber driver or a passenger and the other driver is at fault and they have plenty of insurance to cover your injuries, Uber's uninsured motorist insurance doesn't matter to you. However, if the other driver is at fault and they do not have enough insurance to pay for the value of your claim. Uber's uninsured motorist limit is of huge importance to you. Another big change that Uber made a couple years ago was they switched insurance companies from James River Insurance to Progressive. Now, even if Ray's case happened today, the settlement would likely be the same. Why? The other driver had $1 million bodily injury insurance limit and was 100% at fault. So we did not need to tap into or make a claim against Uber's uninsured motorist insurance coverage. However, if Ray would have been hit by the other driver and the other driver would have been 100% at fault and had no bodily injury insurance coverage, and Ray would have been very badly injured, let's say he had a couple surgeries, then he'd be likely limited to Uber's $250,000 uninsured motorist policy limit. That's because he had a passenger in the car at the time of the crash. Now, if Ray had the app on and he was hit by the van and the van did not have any bodily injury liability coverage or very little, then Ray would likely be limited to $20,000 of uninsured motorist insurance coverage with Uber in the state of Florida. Like any case, if you're injured in an Uber accident, if you need medical treatment, you should get it. The longer you wait to get medical treatment, the insurance companies who may be responsible are going to ultimately argue that you were not badly injured if you needed to wait to get medical treatment. Now, in most cases, if you're badly injured, you want the Uber driver to be at fault. Why? Because Uber driver is going to be subject to Uber's $1 million liability insurance limit. So all things equal, it's best for your case if the Uber driver is at fault because of insurance coverage. Keep in mind that if you use the Uber app to report the accident after it happens, and you mention that the Uber driver was not at fault, and then you later realize, whether it's through an accident reconstructionist or other witnesses, that the Uber driver was at fault, you are ultimately lowering the value of your case. This assumes that the other driver has no insurance, which in a state like Florida is often the case. Many drivers in Florida, unfortunately, I'm not referring to Uber drivers when they have a passenger, but other vehicles often have no bodily injury liability insurance in Florida, or $10,000. For example, with Progressive Insurance Company on most private passenger cars, the average limit is only $10,000 of bodily injury liability coverage. So does Uber pay for accidents? We'll first look at collision coverage. That means if you were the one at fault and you're an Uber driver, will Uber pay for the value of damage to your car? Uber's collision coverage is only going to apply if you have collision coverage on your personal auto insurance policy. And it only applies if the Uber driver is en route, meaning he or she has accepted the ride and they're on the way to pick up a passenger all the way through drop-off. Going back to the collision coverage for one moment, that carries a $1,000 deductible. So if the Uber driver had accepted a ride request all the way through drop-off of passengers, assuming the Uber driver had collision coverage on their personal vehicle, there's a $1,000 deductible, and then Uber's car insurance company will pay any damages to the vehicle above the $1,000. If the Uber driver has the app on, but has not yet accepted the ride, Uber's collision insurance will not pay for damages to the vehicle. If the Uber driver has the app on, but has not yet accepted a ride, he or she is entitled to $10,000 in personal injury protection insurance in a state like Florida, which is where I practice. And in other words, Uber's insurance company, who is Progressive currently in Florida, will pay 80% of the medical bills up to $10,000 and 60% of the lost wages up to the same $10,000. If the Uber driver has accepted a ride request all the way through drop-off of the passenger, the Uber driver is not entitled to PIP through Uber's car insurance. PIP is personal injury protection. Although there's nothing nice about a car accident, the nice thing with Uber car accidents is if an Uber driver is at fault and you're seriously injured, you have up to $1 million that you can make a claim against the Uber driver's insurance policy through currently Progressive in Florida. This is so much better than your average car accident where so many drivers have no bodily injury liability insurance. Now, can you sue Uber for an accident? In Florida, your lawsuit is not going to directly be against Uber. That's because there's a statute, a law, that says that you can't sue Uber if they've taken certain protocols and followed them. However, if the Uber driver is at fault, you can sue the Uber driver, and then Uber's insurance policy kicks in and they will provide an attorney to the Uber driver and they will pay any claim up to $1 million, assuming you can prove your claim is worth that much. How much is the average Uber accident settlement? I would say that the average Uber accident settlement, if I had to make an educated guess, is going to be under $15,000. That's because simply most car accidents do not result in serious injuries. Oftentimes people don't end up getting treatment, but they still may settle with Uber's insurance company or another auto insurance company. Basically, if you have minor injuries, the case is not worth that much. Now, as you can imagine, if you have serious injuries, the case can be worth a significant amount. Maryland attorney Ronald Miller said on his website that he believes Uber and Lyft are overpaying for personal injury claims because they're insisting on confidentiality in the settlement release. So he says that Uber and Lyft are overpaying for the market value of the claim. If that attorney is correct, this is good news if you're injured and the Uber driver is at fault. If you're getting value out of this video, please hit the like button. Now, if you're hit by an Uber driver who has the app on, but they're not engaged in a ride, meaning they have not accepted a ride request, their insurance through Progressive in Florida will pay $50,000 per person to anyone that the Uber driver injures, or $100,000 to everyone in total who the Uber driver injures. They'll also pay for $25,000 in property damage for any damage caused by the Uber driver. So if you're badly injured and an Uber driver is the cause of the accident, you're hoping he or she had the app on. That means they were engaged in a ride, and their insurance policy for liability coverage is up to $1 million. 4 different insurance companies currently insure Uber according to their website as of March 2020. They are Allstate, Farmers, Liberty Mutual, and Progressive. This map shows you which insurance companies insure Uber in different states. There's a chance that Uber continues to change insurance companies, so this map may not be valid in the future. So whose case is better, an Uber passenger or an Uber driver? Well, the Uber passenger is generally never at fault unless he or she was not wearing a seatbelt, but they're generally not at fault for causing the accident. On the other hand, if the Uber driver is 100% at fault, he has no case for personal injury. How long will an Uber car accident case take to settle? It's primarily going to depend on 2 things. 1, the extent of your injury. The second factor is going to be the Uber driver's status at the time of the incident. In other words, did they have the app on, but they were not engaged in a ride, or did they have the app on and they had accepted a ride request? Again, this assumes the Uber driver is at fault. Insurance companies tend to pay the policy limits much quicker if the full value of the case is worth more than the insurance limits. For this reason, if you have bad injuries and the Uber driver was the cause of the crash, and they had the app on but were not engaged in a ride, meaning they don't have passengers or they hadn't yet accepted a ride request, Uber's insurance company will likely quickly pay out the limits. Now in Florida, Uber passengers are not entitled to PIP through Uber's insurance company. Uber, according to the insurance policy that they have online, they say there is no PIP for passengers. What can you get paid for in an Uber accident case? You can get paid for your medical bills, lost wages, diminished value to the car, assuming the Uber driver was at fault or the other driver was at fault. You can get paid for pain and suffering. In states like Florida, you may need to prove that you have a permanent injury or permanent or significant scarring to get money for pain and suffering. These are just some of the many damages you may be able to get. If a family member was killed, you may also be able to get funeral expenses and mental pain and suffering for their death. While I do recommend reporting the accident to the police, whether it's calling 911 if it's an emergency or the local police department if it's not, I recommend contacting an attorney prior to speaking with any insurance representative. Insurance adjusters know how to minimize the value of your case. Their goal is to save the insurance company money. People injured in Uber accidents should often use their health insurance in addition to their auto insurance in a state like Florida where I practice. This can ultimately result in them having the lowest out-of-pocket bills and puts more money in their pocket at the end of the case. Now, like any insurance company, Uber's insurance company will likely pay you more money if you take an ambulance to the hospital. In fact, if you look at their accident reporting form, one of the questions they ask is, did you take an ambulance to the hospital? They ask that question so they can classify the severity of your case. All things equal, people who take an ambulance to the hospital generally have more significant injuries than those who don't. This doesn't mean that your case does not have value if you do not take an ambulance to the hospital. However, generally speaking, a case is better if the individual takes an ambulance to the hospital. Now, assuming you're able to reach a settlement in an Uber accident case and you have health insurance in a state like Florida, you're likely required to pay back the health insurance company for whatever they pay from the settlement. If you have an attorney, the health insurance company, depending on what type of coverage it is, may be required to reduce the amount that you have to pay back by attorney's fees and costs, which can be a huge advantage to getting a personal injury attorney. Also, if you were partially at fault in the accident, the health insurance company may have to reduce their payback amount by your percentage of fault. So let's look at cases where the Uber driver has the app on, but they have not yet accepted a ride. That would mean their limits are $50,000 per person and $100,000 per accident. Which injuries are worth more than $50,000? As a general blanket statement, if you have a tibial plateau fracture, that's a fracture of the lower leg bone right up below the kneecap. If you have a shoulder fracture, a wrist fracture, a femur fracture, your long leg bone right between the kneecap and the hip, or if you have a hip fracture or a brain bleed or obviously a death or any long bone fracture, Uber's insurance company should very quickly be paying out the $50,000 in bodily injury liability coverage, at least in a state like Florida, which is where I practice. Now, if the injured person just has whiplash, or maybe in some instances a herniated disc that's not impinging on the spinal cord or pressing on something else, or the injured person doesn't get medical treatment or fractures a finger, let's say a pinky, I wouldn't expect Uber's insurance company to rush in paying out the $50,000 limit per person. If you are not wearing a seatbelt, does that affect the value of your Uber injury case? Yes, it may. If your injuries would have been prevented by not wearing a seatbelt, the defense, whether it's Uber's insurance company or whichever driver's insurance company is responsible for the crash, they can argue that the value of your claim should be reduced proportionately. In Florida, Uber does not have medical payments coverage on its auto insurance policy. Now, if you check court records, you can see that Uber is very big into maintaining confidentiality to settlements. The potential problem with confidentiality is if the language is not airtight, it can expose the injured person to tax consequences and having to pay the IRS more money than they would have to if this settlement was not confidential. Always speak with an accountant about any tax consequences from a confidential settlement. Is it easier to get money for pain and suffering if the Uber driver who causes the accident, meaning they're careless and they cause the accident, was engaged in a ride? The answer is typically yes, because you do not need to meet Florida's tort threshold. In this case, you don't need to prove that your injury was permanent in order to get money for pain and suffering. Whereas if the Uber driver had the app on, he or she is entitled to PIP, which means they get the tort threshold defense, which means the injured person will likely need to prove that their injury was permanent in order to get money for pain and suffering. Now, there are exceptions to the tort threshold rules, such as if you're on a motorcycle in the state of Florida, and there's some other exceptions as well. On Uber's website, they list the certificate of insurance for every state in the United States and show how much coverage there is and who the insurance company is in that state. You should expect, if you complete the Uber app after an accident, that anything you put in writing and anything also that you tell the Uber claims representative or their insurance company's claim representative that they can later use against you. So although your emotions may be running very high after an accident and you're apprehensive and you're nervous or excited and the adrenaline is flowing and you may not think that your injuries will worsen, everything you put in writing can later be used against you to devalue and decrease the value of your case. All things equal, if an Uber driver was careless and caused the crash and they were engaged in a ride, that means that your injury case may take longer to settle because you're dealing with $1 million limits, and most cases are worth way under $1 million. For example, even if you have 2 surgeries to your arm, in most of those cases, it's going to be worth way under $1 million. Now, after you settle your case with Uber, their insurance company should quickly send you the settlement check. And in Florida, after you've signed the settlement release and sent it to Uber's insurance company, they have 20 days to send you the settlement check. The same is true for other insurance companies. So the typical call that I get in most car accident cases is, "Hey, Justin, I was injured in an accident." Maybe the potential client went to the hospital, maybe they didn't. Maybe they said the Uber driver was at fault, maybe they said the other driver was at fault. And they want to know, do I have a good case or how much is my case worth? The first thing that I think as an attorney when I hear that question is, how bad are your injuries? A lot of people call me, and while they've been in a serious car accident, by the time they've called me, they haven't even gone to the doctor or hospital. So I think in my head, how bad is your injury? It's not likely a very serious injury. That said, some injuries can develop through time, but the number one factor that's going to determine the fair settlement value of the case is the extent of the injury. Simply put, if you're badly injured and someone else is at fault, your case is going to be much, much better than if you are not badly injured, even if someone else is at fault. If you've been in an Uber accident Take photos of the damage to the car. If you ultimately decide to hire an attorney, that can help the attorney gauge whether he's able to take the case or the value of your case. Also, it can be used in your case and in a lawsuit and at trial. All things equal, insurance companies typically pay out more money if the car is badly damaged in an accident. This is because they believe the person is more likely to have been badly injured. To learn how to maximize the value of personal injury cases in the shortest time possible and how to value cases, watch this video here. Thank you and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss a thing.